Hello everyone, we are moving towards week 10, so almost at the very end of the course. And at this point, what I wanted to do was to make sure we ended the course on some of the positive developments in the area of violence and conflict, rather than just to be a series of terrible incidents from week to week, to actually look at the ways in which we've made real inroads and real progress with projects around violence and conflict. So week 11, next week, we'll look in more depth at specific programs, anti-violence programs, what they've achieved, and we'll look at these as case studies at different scales and different levels. This week we're going to look at the idea of design thinking and how that connects into the approach of anti-violence, or designing systems that and environments that are not amenable to conflict and violence. And I use the word harmony. It was a bit of a tricky one to try and find the right word for this, because it's more than anti-violence. It's not just trying to create systems in which violence can't occur, because that can very easily move towards totalitarianism. If you just incapacitate people from doing anything, and take away people's freedoms, you can often reduce the amount of violence, at least temporarily, unless you count systemic violence. So I wanted to use a word, and harmony was the best one I could come up with for designs that moved towards positive community and equality. Now, this recalls, you will have done the I Change module in your first year. All CQU students do that. Remember, it's about CQU being a change-making university and having a role in using human-centered design as an approach to creatively solving problems. And this is where it fits in with the topic of violence. Alright, so I want to just talk through some of the issues that we raise in the materials this week. First, I do a bit of a recap on the design approach and what design is, just in case you've forgotten some of the details from all a year ago, which is probably entirely true, and also to point out that legal systems do not really use a design thinking approach to change. They use a very top-down approach, and they don't use an experimental prototyping approach to testing. So what they will do is a group of elite people will get together and say, here's a problem, we need to solve it. They'll come up with a solution from their point of view, implement it, and then be shocked when a couple of years later and millions of dollars later, it hasn't actually solved the problem. And that's been the conventional approach, is that the elites, the people in power, are those who are best positioned to make these decisions. And if the hoi polloi aren't going to, follow the rules, then that's not their fault. We've realised that's a very short-sighted and a bad way to do anything, which is why we're increasingly using design thinking as an approach, where we actually start with the people who have to work with an area of regulation. We have their input into what will work and what won't, and then we test and prototype before we commit to a final product. And it has had major success in some places. In Victoria, the design firm Portable has worked a lot with the Victorian Justice Department in producing solutions that will work. So design thinking is one of those very useful skills to have as a graduate. All right, and one of the options you have for your third year work placement unit and is to work on a design thinking social innovation project with a team of other students. So rather than necessarily go to an actual workplace and work in an office somewhere, you can work with a group of students on a problem in a community, and that you'll have the opportunity to work with students from a variety of different disciplines and backgrounds, and that's very positive and very powerful. All right, so the reading for this week, the guided reading, is around designing urban systems for violence. and looks at the role of design in this world, and looks at how a design thinking approach has been used in a very destructive way in the escalation of violence using improvised explosive devices. And it's been a bit of a sort of like a design arms race in various parts of the world to design better, cheaper, more effective bombs using just the things that are around. And we have to consider, that design thinking is a value-neutral process, and you can use it to blow people up just as effectively as you can to build a safer community. So it starts with that sort of design arms race that's been going on about being able to design these bombs, and also the attempt to design mechanisms to detect and divert the bombs. So it opens with that idea that design thinking is going on, and it's usually going on from the people who have the least power and rely most on ingenuity. But there's no reason why design can't be used as a broader canvas, and then it moves on to look at designing cities that are not bomb-proof, but bomb-resistant, building structures that can be rebuilt easily, that don't just shatter and fall apart, that you can put back together again, and building surfaces and building textures that don't rely on a nice, clean, white standard wall, that if things get charred or scarred from bombs or conflict, that it actually adds to the texture of the surface and doesn't look immediately like this is a place where violence has occurred. So there's some interesting ideas there. And I included it as a reading this week, just to give you a very different sort of way of thinking around violence and the idea of preventing violence before it occurs. All right, so the next section that we look at looks at the design of spaces, and there's been a long-term, at least since the early 70s, approach to what's been variously called environmental criminology, not meaning as in the natural environment, the built environment, criminology, or defensible space, with looking at ways in which you can try and design communities, community centres, thoroughfares, and spaces to decrease conflict and to make places safer. And usually the way these projects come about is through finding places that are bad, finding places where they're unsafe because they're designed with lots of nooks and crannies. I say designed, but not designed expressly to do this, but designed without thought. So there are shadowy nooks and crannies where people could lie in wait. There are places where they're not lit properly at night. There are stairwells that are away from the view of the rest of the building. There are all the mistakes that we've made over the years in building public spaces that we can learn from and build better spaces. And there's an excellent, if ancient, documentary in there, the Urban Exposure YouTube link, Defensible Space by Oscar Newman, featuring Aylesbury Estate and Prut Ego. It's been uploaded to YouTube in 2015, but it's from 1974, so it's almost as old as I am. And it looks at the urban housing estates in the UK and America, which were an absolute disaster for crime, and looks at the reasons for them and some alternative designs. So these are really good because, it's really old black and white doco, but it actually shows the places as they were then. Unfortunately, some of them still look the way that look pretty similar to that now, and really looks at this grand project of modernist architectural ego that led to the design of these places, where these architects wanted to build these grand soaring monuments to their vision of space age housing, how quickly they just fell apart because there was no consideration to the people that had to live in them and the kind of danger they might be in. So really, it's 40 minutes. It's quite a long doco, but if nothing else from the videos this week, I really recommend that one, and it has some really interesting ideas. And we close with a bit of a discussion of technology and non-violence. and there's a section on technology itself, and the last section's on design of online spaces. So there's some more material to think through there. And I found the book, The Technology of Nonviolence, at the Book Grocers not so long ago. And I was quite fascinated by it because it's a book from 2012. So it's before Facebook, I think, or it's early Facebook, very early Twitter. Maybe Facebook was the Facebook at this point. And it looks at the use of online and network technologies for anti-violence purposes. And it's fascinating, first of all, because there's some interesting case studies in the way in which it was used that I've summarised in the notes, but also because of the optimism at this time when people are saying, hey, there's this new thing called social media, and it's going to make people a lot more able to communicate with each other and see other people's point of views, and it's going to lead to a decrease in violence. And it's just one of those, looking back in retrospect with what's happened, and what's happened in particular with the American Capitol insurrection and the role social media played in that, we can see like there's this heading towards a cliff, this optimism around social media will save us, it'll be a great thing. Not to say that the observations aren't true in that book, and that there isn't still the possibility of using social media to connect people. And certainly we would not have seen such a clear decision, I don't think, in the George Floyd case if there hadn't been 50 people with cameras watching him be murdered and then quickly updating that to social media and spreading around the world like wildfire. The official police report at the time was that George Floyd had suffered a medical incident, and if that was the only evidence anyone had was a police report that said it was a medical incident, it certainly wouldn't have seen the full spectrum of the response that happened. So I think we don't necessarily... We can look at a book like The Technology of Nonviolence with a little bit of cynicism now, and look at how optimistic it was, but we shouldn't throw it all away, and we should still realise that the communication tools that we have available to us are going to serve us well in the future. We need to be sceptical about the things that they do and the dangers are involved, but we also need to be able to make the most of them. So that's the overall picture of this week. A real focus on sort of the urban design aspect of crime prevention and violence protection. The material on defensible space is broadly a criminological theory, so it's not just about violent crime, it's also around property crime as well. But we're most interested in the violence aspect. And I'd also ask you to pay particular attention to the section on the broken windows theory, which was a attempt to hijack defensible space for a right-wing... It wasn't even criminology, but one of the key ideas of defensible space was that if space looks like no one owns it, and it's vandalised and it's not fixed, it'll continue to be vandalised because it's a space where no one's exercising any ownership over it. It's a non-space. So one of the things that Newman recommended was that we are very quick to act when fixing up vandalism. At the time, vandalism included all graffiti, so we've also got an interesting change around there, where graffiti is no longer necessarily considered vandalism. But that got hijacked in the 80s, as many things did, by the right-wing agenda, where they said, well, the way to stop crime is just to severely punish people for the minor crimes, and to go after people who are vandals or break windows or spray graffiti, and crack down on those people, and that will solve crime. That is not what Newman was saying at all. And I think it's also an interesting example of the dangers of having a theory out there and having other people be able to, hijack it, take it over, and bend the meanings and just misrepresent it. Anyway, real bag of interesting things there, and hopefully we can have a little bit of a chat about that before we go into the next set of mediations next week.